The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it reclaimed the city, turning the neon lights of the skyscrapers into blurred, bleeding smears against a pitch-black sky. It was a night meant for hiding, the kind of torrential downpour that turned the streets into slick, dangerous rivers and forced the city's predators into their dens. Inside his sprawling penthouse, Victor Marino stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the metallic tang of a freshly cleaned rifle lingering in the air like a promise of violence. He was a man defined by razor-sharp edges, from his slicked-back hair and tailored charcoal suit to the intricate tattoos that peeked from his cuffs, marking a life built on grit and cold calculation. As the head of the Marino family, Victor didn't just exist in the underworld, he dictated its rhythm with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for the unexpected. He had spent the evening orchestrating the final moves against Gregory Parker, his most hated rival, anticipating every variable and calculating every risk. In Victor's world, control was the only currency that mattered, and he possessed more of it than anyone else in the Pacific Northwest. The heavy silence of the penthouse was a testament to his dominance, broken only by the distant rhythm of the storm. He was turning away from the rain-streaked glass to take a call from his lead enforcer when a soft, rhythmic thud echoed from the foyer. Victor froze, his hand instinctively ghosting toward the holster at his hip. He signaled to his bodyguard, who moved toward the window with a rifle held in a protective stance, scanning the room for a breach. At first, there was only shadow, but then a small figure stepped into the light of the marble hall. Victor's breath hitched in a way he hadn't allowed in years. It wasn't a hitman or a rival enforcer. Sitting on the floor just past the threshold was a little girl, no older than 6, wrapped in a thin blanket that was already soaked through. She looked up at the most feared man in Seattle with eyes that held no fear, only a haunting, quiet trust. The silence of the penthouse, usually a symbol of Victor's absolute authority, felt suddenly fragile as he looked down at the child. Sophie Parker didn't belong in this world of marble, steel, and whispered death threats. Her presence was a glitch in his carefully calibrated reality. "Who brought you here?" Victor's voice was like gravel under a boot, low and dangerous, yet he found himself kneeling to meet her eye level. Behind him, the bodyguard shifted, the barrel of his rifle lowering, but his eyes remaining fixed on the door, anticipating an ambush that hadn't come. Sophie didn't flinch. She reached out a small, trembling hand from beneath the damp blanket and touched the edge of Victor's desk. "My daddy," she whispered, her voice thin but remarkably steady. "He told me there were bad men coming to the house. He told me to run to the tall building with the blue lights and find the man who never loses." Victor's jaw tightened. He knew Gregory Parker was a coward, but he hadn't imagined the man would use his own daughter as a distraction during a raid. Gregory hadn't sent her here for safety. He had abandoned her, likely hoping that Victor's obsession with their rivalry would keep him occupied while Gregory slipped away through the city's back channels. "You left you?" Victor asked, the words tasting like ash. She nodded, her long hair clinging to her cheeks. "He told me he had to go first to make a path, but he said you were the knight. He said even if you were a monster, you were the strongest one." A cold fury ignited in Victor's chest, not at the child, but at the man who had discarded such a soul to save his own skin. He looked at the bodyguard, who gave a sharp, subtle nod, a confirmation that the perimeter was clear and no one had followed her. She was truly alone. Victor reached out, his tattooed fingers hovering for a second before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The protector sentimentality he had buried years ago under layers of grit and blood stirred. Gregory Parker had made a grave mistake. He had handed his greatest vulnerability to his greatest enemy, assuming Victor was the same kind of beast he was. "Your father was wrong about one thing, Sophie,"
Victor said, his tone shifting from predatory to something approaching a dark, protective oath. "He didn't send you here to distract me. He sent you here because he's finished." He stood up, towering over her once more, but this time his shadow felt like a shield rather than a threat. "You're staying here, and in this house, the bad men don't get past the door." The air in the penthouse shifted from the cold, clinical tension of a war room to a confused, heavy stillness as Victor stood back from the child. His lead bodyguard, a man named Elias, who had spent a decade seeing Victor treat life as a disposable asset, didn't move his hand from the rifle. He watched Sophie with a gaze that looked for wires, for poisons, for any trick Gregory Parker might have planted in his own flesh and blood.
"Sir," Elias started, his voice a low vibration of caution. "The protocols for an unverified entry are clear. We need to move her to the basement. We need to know exactly how she got past the lobby and who gave her the key card." Victor didn't look at him. He remained focused on Sophie, who was shivering so violently that the damp blanket rattled against the marble floor. "The protocol is whatever I say it is, Elias," Victor replied, the grit in his voice signaling a finality that brooked no argument. "Go to the kitchen, bring back something warm. Soup, tea, whatever it is children eat when they've been left in a storm." Elias hesitated. His eyes darted to the other men standing in the shadows of the hallway. They were warriors, built for the lion's den, and they looked at the tiny, sodden girl as if she were a live grenade. To them, her presence was a breach. To Victor, her presence was a mirror he wasn't yet ready to look into. "And the interrogation?" another man asked from the corner, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm. "Parker is in the wind. She's the only link we have to his extraction point." Victor turned then, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal figure against the rain-streaked glass. The neo-noir lighting of the penthouse caught the glint of his gold watch and the dark ink on his neck. "She isn't a link," he said, his tone dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "She is a guest. Get the food, get a dry blanket from the master suite. If anyone raises their voice or their weapon near her again, they'll answer to me personally." The men drifted back into the shadows, their wariness replaced by a stunned, silent obedience. As Elias headed toward the kitchen, Victor reached down and scooped the girl up. She was lighter than a feather, a fragile weight that felt alien against his chest, which had long been shielded by Kevlar and stone. He sat her on the velvet sofa, wrapping her in the dry, heavy wool Elias brought back minutes later. Sophie looked up at him through wet lashes, her curiosity slowly winning over her exhaustion. Victor didn't ask about Gregory's escape or the Vulture Syndicate's movements. Instead, he simply watched her take her first sip of tea, realizing that the monster Gregory had described was now the only thing standing between this girl and a city that wanted her dead. The vibration of the burner phone against the mahogany desk sounded like a rattlesnake in the quiet room. Sophie had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep on the velvet sofa, her small hand still clutching the edge of the heavy wool blanket Victor's men had provided. Victor stared at the screen for a beat, the caller ID a string of scrambled digits he recognized instantly. He stepped toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass like distant, cold stars. He pressed the receiver to his ear, but said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch until the man on the other end grew impatient. "I hope you're enjoying the view from your ivory tower, Victor." Gregory Parker's voice crackled through the line, breathless and sharp with a frantic kind of triumph. "The vultures are picking apart my territory, and I'm halfway to the coast. By the time you realize I've slipped the noose, I'll be a ghost." Victor's eyes remained on Sophie's rhythmic breathing. "You left something behind, Gregory," he said, his voice a low, lethal hum. A jagged laugh came through the speaker. "The girl? Consider her a gift. I figured her crying would slow your boys down just enough to give me the lead I needed. What are you going to do, Victor? Hold her for ransom? Threaten to send her back to you in pieces? We both know I won't pay, and we both know you don't have the stomach for that kind of mess."
Victor felt a familiar coldness settle in his marrow, but it wasn't the tactical frost of a hit, it was a pure, focused loathing. He watched as Sophie stirred in her sleep, her brow furrowing as if the very sound of her father's voice, even muffled, brought back the rain and the fear. "She told me you sent her here because I was the only man who doesn't lose," Victor said, his tone dropping into a range that made the bodyguard near the door stiffen. "She thinks you're a hero making a path. She thinks I'm the knight you chose to keep her safe. She's a child. She believes in fairy tales. Use her. Kill her. I don't care. Just know that while you're playing babysitter, I'm the one who escaped the Marino reach." Victor leaned closer to the glass, his own reflection looking back with eyes that had seen too much darkness to ever be truly light again. "You didn't escape anything, Gregory. You just traded your soul for a few extra miles of road." He took a slow breath, his gaze fixing on the girl's peaceful face. "You don't deserve her. You don't deserve the air she breathes or the memory of her name. From this moment on, she isn't a Parker. She's under my protection. And if you ever even look toward Seattle again, I won't just find you. I'll make sure the world forgets you ever existed." Without waiting for a reply, he crushed the burner phone in his hand until the screen shattered into a web of black glass. He tossed the remains into the trash and walked back to the sofa, sitting on the edge of the coffee table to watch the girl who was now his responsibility and his redemption. The calm in the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the city lights outside the window. Red emergency strobes kicked in, bathing the marble and chrome in a rhythmic, bloody pulse. Victor was on his feet before the first pane of glass detonated, the secondary explosion of a breaching charge rattling the foundations of the building. "Elias, perimeter!" Victor roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in the air. He didn't reach for the heavy rifle, he reached for Sophie. She woke with a scream that was swallowed by the thunder of automatic fire raking the ceiling. Victor scooped her up, shielding her small frame with his own Kevlar-lined chest, and dove behind the reinforced mahogany desk. "Stay down, little bird," he hissed, his tone a jarring blend of lethal focus and terrifying gentleness. "Close your eyes. Don't open them until I tell you." Through the haze of drywall dust and shattered glass, the silhouettes of the vulture syndicate filtered through the shattered windows, fast roping from the roof. These weren't Gregory's loyalists. These were the scavengers who had turned on him, looking to clean up the Parker heir to ensure no one could ever claim the Parker throne. Victor pulled a suppressed handgun from his waistband, his movements fluid and devoid of hesitation. He was no longer the brooding philosopher staring at the rain. He was the predator who had built an empire on the bones of men like these. As the first mercenary stepped into the light, Victor leaned out, his tattoos flexing as he fired 2 precise shots. The man crumpled silently. The room became a symphony of neo-noir violence, the rhythmic thud of suppressed fire, the shatter of expensive crystal, and the grunt of dying men. Elias and the other guards moved like shadows, flanking the intruders, but Victor stayed anchored to the desk. He was the center of the storm. When a stray bullet chipped the wood inches from Sophie's head, a primal protective rage surged through him. He rose from cover, moving with a terrifying speed that defied his heavy frame. He didn't just defend, he hunted. He cleared the room with a cold, surgical efficiency, his eyes never leaving the doorway to the inner hall where Sophie lay curled in a ball. Within minutes, the penthouse returned to a state of heavy, ringing silence, save for the hiss of the rain through the broken windows. Victor knelt back down, his breathing even despite the adrenaline. He reloaded his weapon before looking at the child. Sophie peeked out from under her arms, her face pale, but her eyes fixed on him with that same impossible trust. "Are they gone?" she whispered. Victor wiped a smudge of soot from her forehead with a steady thumb. "They're gone, Sophie," he said, the protector sentimentality now a permanent part of his armor. "And they aren't coming back." In the aftermath of the siege, the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress undergoing repairs. Victor sat at his mahogany desk, the surface now scarred by deep gouges from shrapnel. He was surrounded by maps of the city's shipping districts and decrypted logs of the Vulture Syndicate's movements, his mind already 3 steps ahead in the war for Seattle's soul. A few feet away, Sophie sat on the floor, tucked into her favorite corner with a box of crayons and the same battered teddy bear. She was remarkably quiet, her long hair falling over her shoulders as she carefully colored a picture of a knight in silver armor. She didn't flinch when Elias entered the room to report on the disposal of the intruders, nor did she shy away when Victor snapped a harsh order into his encrypted phone. To her, the violence of the previous night wasn't a source of terror, but a shield, a wall of iron that Victor had built around her. Victor looked up from a ledger, his gaze softening as it landed on the child. The protector sentimentality that once felt like a liability now felt like his only remaining anchor to humanity. He watched as she reached out to touch the dark, swirling tattoos on his forearm, the ink that marked him as a monster to the rest of the world. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice small and curious. "The ink?" Victor asked, leaning back. "Only when it was fresh." "No," she said, looking up at him with those eyes that held an impossible, fearless trust. "Does it hurt to be the one who has to fight the bad men? You look tired, Mr. Victor." Victor paused, the weight of a decade of underworld politics and bloodshed pressing down on him in that single moment. He realized then that Sophie saw the man beneath the predator. She didn't see a mafia boss. She saw the knight her father had promised, even if that knight was covered in scars and ink. She wasn't afraid of his power because she knew it was the only thing keeping the rain and the vultures at bay. "I'm not tired as long as you're safe, Sophie," Victor said, his voice dropping into that dark protective register that had become her lullaby. He reached out and tapped the picture of the knight she had drawn. "But every knight needs a reason to keep the armor on. I think I finally found mine." The following week, the atmosphere within the Seattle penthouse shifted, moving from the cold anticipation of a strike to the quiet gravity of a sanctuary. Victor spent his mornings at the head of the long mahogany table, but his eyes frequently drifted from the encrypted tablets to the far end of the room, where Sophie was attempting to teach his stoic bodyguard Elias how to properly fold a paper airplane. For years, Victor had measured his power by the silence that fell when he entered a room and the fear that kept his rivals in check, believing that a king was defined by the depth of his shadow. He watched as Sophie laughed when the paper spiraled into a decorative urn, a sound that cut through the heavy neo-noir bloom of the office like a blade of light. In that moment, Victor realized that ruling through fear was a hollow, exhausting pursuit. It was a crown of glass that required constant, violent maintenance. The responsibility of being a guardian, however, felt like a different kind of strength entirely. It wasn't just about who he could crush, it was about what he was willing to preserve. "Sir," Elias whispered, stepping away from the child to approach the desk, his face back to its stony mask. "The Vulture Syndicate is consolidating their hold on the northern docks. They expect us to retaliate by burning the warehouses. It's the standard play." Victor looked at his hands, where the ink of his past sins was etched into his skin. Usually, he would have ordered the fire without a second thought, letting the city know the cost of defying a Marino. But as he looked at Sophie, who was now carefully coloring a new picture for him, he realized he didn't want to bring more smoke into the world she was forced to live in. "Change the play," Victor said, his voice dropping into that dark protective register. "Don't burn the warehouses. Seize the shipments and reroute them to the community centers in the lower district. If the vultures want to fight, they can fight me in the streets, but I'm done feeding the fire for the sake of an image." Elias hesitated, the confusion of the lion's den returning to his eyes. "That's not how we keep control, Victor. That's not how people fear us." Victor stood up, his tailored suit sharp and his presence as commanding as ever, but there was a new, grounded intensity in his gaze. "Fear is a temporary currency, Elias. Loyalty, the kind that comes from knowing you're the shield, that lasts forever." He walked over to Sophie, who proudly held up her latest drawing, a large, dark figure standing in front of a small girl, holding an umbrella against a storm of red ink. Victor took the paper with a steady hand, realizing he had finally traded the hollow power of a tyrant for the heavy, honorable weight of a protector. The fog over the West Seattle Bridge was a thick, suffocating shroud that tasted of salt and impending rain. Victor stood at the center of the span, his silhouette carved from the darkness by the flickering orange glow of a nearby flare. Behind him, Elias and a hand-picked squad of men stood like statues, their weapons held at a low ready, while Sophie waited in the armored interior of the lead SUV, her small face pressed against the tinted glass. A pair of headlights cut through the mist as a battered sedan rolled to a stop 50 yards away. Gregory Parker stepped out, looking like a ghost of the man he once was, his clothes disheveled, his eyes darting with a frantic, cornered energy. He had come for the payout he thought he could still squeeze from the wreckage of his life, oblivious to the fact that he was no longer a player in this game, but the bait. "You're late, Gregory," Gregory called out, his voice cracking against the wind. "Give me the girl and the offshore codes and I'll disappear. I'll leave the city to you and your ink-stained soul." Victor didn't move. He didn't even reach for his weapon. "You don't have any chips left to play, Gregory," Victor said, his voice a steady, chilling anchor in the storm. "The vultures didn't follow you here to see you get paid. They followed you here to see you die." The realization hit Gregory just as the red laser dots began to dance across his chest. From the steel girders above and the shadows of the bridge pylons, the Vulture Syndicate emerged. They weren't interested in an exchange. They were here for a massacre, intending to eliminate the last of the Parkers and the man who had dared to protect her in one bloody sweep. "Get down!" Victor roared, but the command wasn't for Gregory. It was for his men to form a perimeter around the SUV. The bridge erupted into a cacophony of neo-noir chaos. Muzzle flashes strobed through the fog, turning the night into series of jagged, violent snapshots. Gregory screamed and dove for cover behind his car as the vultures opened fire, their rounds pinging off the asphalt and the reinforced plating of Victor's vehicles. Victor went into protector mode with surgical precision, firing his suppressed handgun as he retreated toward the SUV. He didn't care about the territory or the codes anymore. His world had narrowed down to the metal box containing the child who had called him a knight. As a grenade detonated near the bridge railing, sending a shower of sparks and concrete into the air, Victor realized this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was the moment the monster had to finally burn the bridge to his past to keep the future alive. The bridge was a furnace of twisted steel and orange heat as the Vulture's secondary charges detonated, turning the Seattle fog into a scalding mist. Victor moved through the smoke like a wraith, his handgun steady despite the chaos around him. Through the haze, he saw Gregory Parker scrambling toward a secondary getaway vehicle, a man reduced to a panicked shadow, leaving a trail of cowardice in his wake. Victor raised his weapon, the front sight post settling perfectly over Gregory's back. This was the moment his life had been building towards, the final removal of a thorn that had plagued the Marino name for a decade. One squeeze of the trigger would end the war and solidify his reign through the very blood he had sworn to spill. But then a sound pierced the roar of the fire, a sharp, thin cry that didn't belong in a war zone. "Victor!" He turned his head just enough to see the SUV. A stray mortar had slammed into the asphalt, flipping the armored vehicle onto its side. Glass lay like diamonds on the burning bridge, and a thick plume of black smoke was curling from the crushed hood. Sophie's small, pale hand was pressed against the cracked window, her eyes wide with a terror that no knight should ever allow his ward to feel.
For a split second, Victor looked back at Gregory. His enemy was almost at the door of the car, his escape nearly guaranteed. If Victor took the shot now, Gregory would die, but the fire would reach the SUV's fuel line before Victor could make it back. The monster within him screamed to finish the job, to take the kill he had earned with years of grit and neo-noir calculations. Instead, Victor lowered his gun. He didn't just lower it, he dropped it into the abyss of the sound below, a final rejection of the predator he had once been. He sprinted toward the wreckage, his boots thudding against the vibrating steel of the bridge. Gregory's engine roared to life, tires screeching as he sped away into the night, but Victor didn't even flinch. He reached the SUV just as the first licks of flame began to crawl over the undercarriage. With a roar of exertion that came from a buried protective well of humanity, he wrenched the jammed door from its hinges. He reached into the heat and the glass, his tattooed arms shielding the girl from the falling sparks. As he pulled Sophie into his chest, her small arms locked around his neck in a desperate, shivering hold. He carried her away from the explosion, the bridge burning behind them like the funeral pyre of the man he used to be. He had let his enemy go, but as he felt Sophie's heart beating against his own, Victor knew he had finally won the only fight that mattered. 10 years had passed, but the rain in Seattle still held the same rhythmic, melancholic beat against the reinforced glass of the Marino estate. Victor stood by the window. His silhouette remains as sharp and imposing as ever, though the silver at his temples and the deeper lines around his eyes spoke of a decade spent in a different kind of war. He was still the man whose name silenced rooms, but the empire he governed had undergone a quiet, radical metamorphosis. The shipping routes once used for contraband now moved medical supplies and food to the city's forgotten districts, and his payroll was no longer just for soldiers, but for the teachers and doctors who staffed the Marino Foundation's safe houses. The world still called him a monster, a ghost who pulled the strings of the Pacific Northwest from the shadows, but Victor no longer cared for the world's definitions. His power was no longer a cage of fear, it was a fortress for the vulnerable. He had learned that a monster's shadow, if large enough, could be the safest place for a child to grow. A light knock at the door broke his reverie. Sophie, now 16, stepped into the room with the effortless grace of someone who had never known the abandonment of a rain-slicked bridge. She didn't look like a Parker, she looked like a Marino, confident, sharp-eyed, and carrying a sketchbook that was always filled with the bright colors he had once forgotten existed. "I finished the design for the new youth center in the lower district," she said, leaning against the mahogany desk that still bore the scars of a siege long ago. She looked at him with that same fearless trust, the kind that saved his soul on a night he was supposed to be hunting her father. "It has a garden on the roof. I remembered what you said about everyone needing a place where the rain can't touch them." Victor reached out, his tattooed hand, the hand that had once crushed phones and held rifles, resting gently on her shoulder. "It's perfect, Sophie," he replied, his voice a low, protective hum. Gregory Parker was a name the city had forgotten, a coward who had vanished into the static of history, but Victor Marino remained. He was the ghost of Seattle, the legendary guardian who had traded his crown of glass for a shield of iron. As they looked out at the city together, the neon lights bleeding into the mist, Victor knew his legacy wasn't written in the blood he had spilled, but in the girl who stood beside him, safe and thriving in the heart of the storm.